Hi, everybody. Thanks for watching this video. Was this God's idea? Our series on the creation account of Genesis, points, counterpoints, and implications. This is supposed to be week 4, but we're actually changing plans up a little bit and condensing weeks 4, 5, and 6 into one video. All 3 of these weeks deal with different perspectives or viewpoints of how to read and interpret Genesis. So we're going to start with the perspective that Genesis 1 through 11 is not history. And we want to open this up with a quote from Kenton Sparks. And Kenton Sparks is actually the person who writes from this viewpoint. This quote is, "Scripture is not a room filled with clairvoyant theologians who have the same ideas and agree on every point. It is better understood as a room of wise elders, each an invited guest because of his unique voice and relation to God. Every elder has insight, but no elder has all of the answers." So again, a lot of this material comes from the book Genesis, History, Fiction, or Neither. So again, we're starting with this idea that Genesis is not meant to be historical. So the premise here is that genres are flexible categories which help us make sense of and engage the world. The genres of Genesis 1 through 11 might be categorized as ancient historiography, which means it is not a narrative intended to produce an actual history. So let's listen to some of the claims to back up this view. One of the first claims is that the Genesis myth, as it is called, compares in many ways to Mesopotamian generic traditions. We're using generic meaning genre here, how they wrote. It's similar in some ways because there's this divine animation of human life, like we see even in the Genesis account where God breathed life into Adam. But it's also different in a significant way that God's image is passed on to all humanity in the Genesis account, the Imago Dei. As an important side note here, this is one of the meanings, actually the main one behind the title of this series, was this God's idea. In all this debate about literature and genre and science, we hold to this belief that each person was God's idea before coming into existence. The Bible teaches here that people are made to be the image bearers, made in the likeness of God. This is the starting place of all of Scripture. We go to Genesis 1, and in Genesis 1:27 it says, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female, he created them." And we often start our theology and our beliefs about ourselves, for that matter, in Genesis 3 as a cursed people. We should not ignore one for the other. Yes, sin may have entered the picture. And yes, it may have tainted our humanity. And yes, the image that we bear may be distorted, but we are still image bearers nonetheless. Every person, regardless of what they profess, whether literal or not, is up for debate, but it is the point of the lesson either way. And we learned early on that the image of God has both male and female elements because we were created in his image as male and female, which means none of us has all of God. We don't have more of the image of God as men. We are created by a God who is above and apart from his creation. We serve and worship a God outside of gender. God is not a boy or a girl. He is God. Okay, back on topic. I got off on a tangent there. Sorry about that. Back to the claims of this theory. We have a claim that the lineage, as we look at that, as it's written in Genesis 4 and 5, is written by 2 different authors. And furthermore, Genesis 5, the ages are not literal, and they really can't be used to reconstruct a timeline. It wasn't written for that purpose, is the claim here. And the claim also goes on to say that the flood account is written by 2 different authors as well. So the rationale for this claim is that there are 2 different accounts of many of the details, 2 separate announcements of the flood, 2 separate commands to load the animals, one in pairs, one in 7 pairs, 2 different boardings of the ark, one 7 days before, one the day of, 2 separate flood chronologies, one with the emphasis on the 40 days, another one over a year or lasting a year. Two separate divine promises at the end of the story. This position also notes that the shift in usage of the name of God from Elohim to Yahweh. As it relates specifically to the topic of creation, there's a claim that Genesis 1 and 2 are accounts from two different authors as well. For example, Genesis 1 describes animals being created before humans, while Genesis 2 seems to imply that animals are created between Adam and Eve, as Adam finds no suitable helper, according to this interpretation. So it begs the question, why would a single author report contradictory facts if reporting actual history? So if the beginning of the Bible is not an historical record written by one person retelling actual events, then what is it? So the theory here goes like this, that the Jews, the ancient Israelites, used what is called elite emulation to compose texts that imitated the power structure of those who oppressed them, such as the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Persians. So an example of this is the Tower of Babel, or Babel. This story was directed as a, quote, piece of political resistance to Assyrian occupation. It was a parody of Sargon, a king who ruled in the 8th century BC and who had conquered Israel. Sargon had ambitious building projects, boasted of uniting the world in one speech, and failed to construct the ultimate palace. A later scribe may have shifted it from Assyria to Babylon, hence the Tower of Babel. So this viewpoint puts a lot of weight into the idea of multiple authors coming together to tell a story. There may be a response to some actual events, but their purpose is not to give us an accurate recount of any actual events. That's just not their intent. So let's shift over to another theory. This theory blends both myth and history in how we read and interpret Genesis 1 through 11. So this perspective of Scripture says that Genesis is proto-historical. The proto part deals with how Scripture models how God deals with humans. It deals with proto, meaning first. So it's our initial understanding of God. And yet there's a historical element that describes past realities and the lessons that we learn from them. This approach suggests that there is a historical reality to some of what we read in the early chapters of the Bible, but it's not purely historical. The text goes in and out of history to narrative. In my own interpretation of this stance, I would use an analogy to say that this is not the play-by-play announcer at a game, giving you only the facts of who passed the ball, how many points are on the scoreboard, how much time is left in the game, but it's the color commentary, the analyst who sits next to the play-by-play announcer and provides background and interpretation. The coach needs to call a timeout so that team can whatever. Or the leg injury is really affecting so-and-so's performance, so they're going to need to sub in another player if they want to press and get back in this game. So they're interpreting it, giving their opinion and their perspective on the actual events that are happening. So let's take the example of genealogies that we mentioned in the last part. This view contends that genealogies are linear and simple in some cases, but segmented in others. So when we talk about linear, we're saying that the genealogy shows connection between the generations and emphasizes the point that the offspring are in the image of their parents. Now, the ultimate example of this that we find in Genesis is Adam being made in the image of God. But also, the claim is that the genealogies are sometimes segmented. Little segments of the genealogies will serve to make claims about certain territories or skills of those people that are mentioned in that section. Now, genealogies are the backbone of Genesis 1 through 11, and there's an organized structure to it all. And we have to ask ourselves, what does that teach us? And there's this movement back and forth between lineage and narration or storytelling. So in and out of the actual events to this narration and this perspective, the color commentary. So let's turn to the idea of myth. That's a critical part of this theory, is the interpretation of myth itself. As I said at the outset of this series, much of the debate about how to read the Bible is more focused on the first part of that phrase, how to read, than it is about theology. So when considering genre and literature and interpretation of text, there is this whole debate centered on this idea of myth. It comes into play in how we understand Genesis. Is Genesis 1 through 11 myth? Well, Gordon Wenham, in defense of this proto-historical approach, writes that there are problems with the word myth. To many people, myth equals false, and it has a negative connotation. But does it really have to mean false? Others realize that myth, it just means to be a different way of expressing truth. They do not categorize myth as unscientific or irrational. However, they admit that the everyday use of the word implies that myth is a false or misleading belief. So there's a language barrier. One of the things that this perspective does, I talk a lot when interpreting the Bible and reading the Bible to people about, is it describing or prescribing? So is what we're reading, especially in the Old Testament, description or prescription? And what this would argue is that it's both description and prescription, serving both purposes. As myth, Genesis can both describe the life of an ancient Israelite and prescribe a pattern for society. Wenham, who I just quoted, writes, quote, "These chapters contain stories that both illustrate important social and theological principles, yet they all tell of unique occurrences," because it's that proto piece, that one-time initial event. While doing this, Genesis can and does present theological lessons. So the important lessons that we take away from Genesis with this reading is that there's only one God who is present and he is active. God is set over and above all elements, the sun, the moon, the stars, that seem to usually represent other gods or deities in other cultures. And God creates with a purpose. He sets up the world for man. Our final theory that we're going to look at is the theory that Genesis actually is historical and does retell actual events. The final viewpoint really doesn't take long to unpack at all. It's the view that it's more literal, it's historical. The reason it doesn't take much time to analyze is because the proponents of this perspective would just say that it's the most common sense, straightforward, and simplest reading of the text. They would contend that the others, while they've come up with these great theories, are really just working too hard to come up with something and come up with all these alternative interpretations. So this position rests mostly on the fact that there are known places and times and people in Genesis. For example, we have a setting, Eden, particular geographic location in the ancient Near East. You can go on a map and track down where this supposedly happened. Another reason it doesn't take much time to analyze is because the writing itself has an intentional structure to it. It is written in such a way as you would expect it to be written to establish a historical record of families. So we see the genealogies and we see the telling of a story as you would if you were recalling lineage. The language of the Old Testament seems to be very careful to avoid polytheism. So the writings talk about the moon and the sun called the lesser light and the greater light, to not be confused with the names for the moon and sun deities at that time. So we have three perspectives, three theories of how to approach Genesis. Is it fiction? Is it history? Or is it neither? So as we reflect on these three theories, some questions to consider. What do you see as the strengths and weaknesses in each view? Does any one of these three theories answer questions for you? Something you've been struggling with or wondering about in the Bible, and then one of these theories comes along and go, oh, okay, well, that helps make that issue make sense for me. Does any one of these three theories actually raise more questions for you? Well, if that theory was true, then what about blank? Those are some things to reflect on and also discuss with others. Thanks for listening to this video.